let's come to the fifth presentation in Hermetic America. We're understanding that the United States, at the current moment, is in a crisis threshold that is there not because of purely political reasons, but at the deepest levels where the flows of nature come into the phenomena of existence. The first dimension that occurs is time. And time manifests itself as a difference between here and now, which the here now has a there quality, and this cinches the dynamics of a field of nature into forms that integrate, they integral, and they emerge in such a way that they can disappear instantly and reappear instantly. We know in high energy physics that this occurs all the time. Particles, subatomic particles, come in and out of phenomenal existence all the time. And when they reoccur precisely. They have exactly a precise, repeatable quanta of energy at every iteration in which they occur, so that one can understand that for phenomena, for existential things, for forms in the universe, they are precise. But their precision is articulated by a mystery that is not precise precisely because it is infinite. And so our kind have for quite a long while talked about that as a zero, not a 0 point. There's no such thing as a 0 point. It is a zero field that complements a quanta precision existentiality. And that it isn't that one dominates over the other or one succeeds the other. It's that they occur as a pair. And so parity is not just a parity between ones or between twos. The deepest parity is between 1 and 0. And so you find that this is one of the great themes of human wisdom. "5,000 years ago, when larger cultural constructs were becoming the first civilizations, one of the earliest civilizations was Egypt. And part of the quality of a civilization is to be able to record the dynamics of remembering in such a way that the record is written phenomenally and one can learn to read it. But in learning to read it, one has to read in between the letters, in between the hieroglyphs, in between the lines, and to recognize that what is written in the context of what cannot be written. And so one of the earliest symbols for understanding wisdom is the finger to the lips. that over the thousands of years has become Hermetic silence. It's not that it is a secret that shouldn't be told. It is a holiness that cannot be told but must be presenced. And so the Hermetic tradition always has a respect for the tacit presence of the holy, not out there somewhere, but articulately interspersed everywhere that existence occurs and every time it occurs. And the grace way of speaking is that life is a gift and existence is a treasure, and that our ability to live by it is precious. Now, this gets lost from time to time. 5,000 years ago, at the beginnings of Egyptian civilization, there was such a figure as Thoth, the inventor of writing, the inventor of hieroglyphs. And he is shown, for instance, in the great psychostasia, the weighing of the soul of the dead against the feather plume that Mot, justice, provides. And she has provided this pure feather, and your soul is being weighed by Anubis in the psychostasia illumination to the earliest qualities of this possible balance. Thoth records this. If you are too heavy, it means that you have not articulated your existence so that it is equally balanced with zeros and ones and has accumulated glue. And so the ones predominate, it's too heavy. You're fed to the little monster that's waiting. The quality of misunderstanding the weighing of ones and zeros to where it gets skewed, where you weigh ones with ones, is a worldly misunderstanding of the primordial kind. Not the first kind, before the first. It is primordial. If one does not understand the pairedness of 1 and 0, one cannot understand then that the mystery of 2 is a tuning of 1 and 0 and is not just 1 plus 1, but on the deepest level is 1 and 0 as a set that are 2, but you only count it as a bit. You can reiterate that so quickly that you can have a trillion bits, a terabyte of ones and zeros, and it will play out as if it were the motion of the world. Computers work this way. The neurophysiological brain and its extension into the body works this way as well. And what is first shareable are our mutual zeros. We share that mystery, not from an esoteric inculcation, but primordially, eternally, from the very occurrence of reality. Now, the misunderstanding of the skewed mind is that more and more it gets used to identifying like 1 equals 1 or A equals A, and that identification is an equation that is primordially deceptive. It's useful as everyone knows, in certain calculations. But beyond calculations, it is fundamentally even more than basically, it is a deception. A deception that politely is called appearance. And so we can work with appearances phenomenally and with the form of our mind, having a referentiality to that phenomenality, and saying for appearances that this is identity, an identification. The Hermetic tradition learned early that this flaw creeps in terms of time forms. And when the Egyptian civilization was finally run out about 4,000 years ago, the understanding that had led to the demise of the Old Kingdom led finally through an interim period where chaos occurred. It re-emerged in what is called the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. But the Middle Kingdom of Egypt was because a deep African wisdom from Nubia and from further south in what today we call Ethiopia entered into a transform, and the Middle Kingdom now, instead of just having Thoth as the master of symbols and their reading of it, the recording of remembering in this way, a new quality came into play and was called, the Greek name for it is the one that has been passed on for the last 3,000 years, agathodaimon, meaning the good spirit. And the good spirit is the second Hermes, is a black African wisdom, Hermes, that one has to have a kinesthetic sense that when you speak the language in a precise cadence, which is illustrated by the balance of you in your phenomenality with your mystery. And that the resonance of that is that it can be heard by someone who has tuned themselves to the mystery and to the precision of the cadence of the language. 2,000 years after that, Jesus came, and one of his deepest phrases that reoccurs, not as a warning, but as an invitation, let those who have ears to hear, let them hear. Are tuning ourselves, not just to the cadence of what the language is in its precision, articulated as exactly and accurately as possible, but that there is a kinesthetic sense also that the mystery is present. It is present, permeating, articulating, and airing out our ability to presence together. And the mystery of this, I have called for the last 30 years, shared presence. Our capacity is not as phenomenal existential bodies, even with the addition of formal structured minds, but a further transform to the prisms of spiritual persons, to the jewels of personality that are able to scintillate, to live in the field of nature naturally, but to also transform it by being able to take the field of a differential conscious vision and bring that into a complementarity with the field of nature. And these fields together give us a complexity out of which emerges not just existence and structures of symbols, but emerges the prismatic qualities of spirit that now are able to tune themselves forward, not just referentially back, but forward to the cosmos as it is just freshly emerging with our participation as an added quality to it and recognizes us. The United States, when it was founded, came out of that third Hermetic quality. The ancient Hermetic, the good spirit, and the Hermes Trismegistus. Because it was about 500 years ago in northern Italy that the quintessential dimension of transformation for the classical world, which included Egypt, which included India, which included ancient Iran, which included a great swath of the world, not just Greece and Italy, but that ancient classical ecumene, as Alexander the Great was taught to call it, the world family, that the world family lives in a complex, layered history that are time forms that occur. And when the time forms change, there is a threshold where the old no longer works right, no longer really works properly, and the new must be engendered newly, freshly, so that it can work, but to work with new conditions, new transformations. We live in 2008 on a threshold where that is being done before our eyes, and it affects the entire planet, because the United States is the first planetary society and has the beacon quality of being able now for more than 300 years to alert our kind to possibilities which are new that one would have never seen before, and therefore to be patient and sharing about the emergence of the new. And we are seeing that as we speak every day now. What has happened is that not only are there certain time forms that change, the classic way of understanding it was every 500 years, or every pair of 500 years every millennium, or every pair of millennium every aeon. But there are certain times where all of those time forms coalesce. It's like having all the planets of the star system lined. We had an alignment of all the time forms in 1991. It meant that it initiated a complex threshold that was last seen in the times of Jesus. And his understanding of it was more primordial than the setting up of a church structure which became Christianity. The original way of speaking of it was that it was the way. And one can read the words, I am the way, the truth, and the light. It is not a church statement, it is a cosmic portal that can be presenced. Presenced in such a way that it also shares presence with all of the other great religious visions. One case in point, the historical Buddha lived about 500 years before Jesus. When the way was introduced to the transform of classical Buddhism, it became the Mahayana, the Great Way. And the emphasis was no longer simply on the Buddha, but the emphasis was on the Bodhisattva as the conveyor of transformed guidance and help. The Bodhisattva is an Indian Mahayana version of Hermes Trismegistus. And the carrier of that initial transform to India was by St. Thomas, early in 40 AD. What happened 500 years ago in the North Italian Renaissance was the rebirth of learning, the rediscovery that our kind, human beings like ourselves, have no limit to what we can learn, but that the farther refinements of learning are based on a shared presencing, not on an individualism, but on a resonant set of spirit persons who vision together, and the working out of their visioning together produces a history which is called civilization. So that the very nature of civilizations is a kaleidoscopic consciousness of the shared presencing of the population, of the people. The community, not just of the whole, the community of the whole potential. And it is this quality that 250 years ago came to a brilliant focus in a little town in Virginia, Charlottesville, with the founding of the University of Virginia by Thomas Jefferson. And he called it his academical village. And so you can go to the website of virginia.edu/academic village, and you will find a website, Jefferson's Academical Village. In 1993, this 100-page monograph was put out by the Bailey Museum of the University of Virginia to commemorate the 250th birthday of Thomas Jefferson. What is interesting here is that Jefferson tutored in such a way that when he was younger, he was given one of the best classical educations you could have, in the sense that he learned to read Greek. He learned to read Latin, in addition to French and English, a little bit of Italian, a little bit of Spanish. So that later on, in one of his letters, he said, however great this translation of the Iliad, he was speaking of Alexander Pope's famous translation of the Iliad, he said it is dull compared to Homer's Greek. And that if you can read a visionary field into the personal art of the language so that the poetic comes out, you transcend the rhetorical structure of translation, which has for its sense of order a referent back to the phenomenality of the words, of the phrases, of the letters arranged in a more or less integral only presentation. Whereas a poetic is different from a rhetoric. A poetic has the kinetic, mysterious articulation to it, so that one is not speaking prose, but even good prose cannot be well translated, but one is speaking poetry. And it is in the poetry, it is in the poetic of whatever we do that there is the art. And there is such a thing, rediscovered in the Renaissance, there is an art to learning. And that when one has the art of learning, one of the concomitants of that is that the whole population that learns together transforms together. It doesn't matter where they came from, who they are, class, gender, social position, wealth, none of it makes any difference. The community that learns together, really learns together, has transformed together. They get each other in a deeper way than just the identifications. They are together. There was a beautiful illustration of this in the 1960s in San Francisco. The Potrero Hill group put out a thing called the Whole Earth Catalog. And there was a first photo of the whole Earth from space that was on the cover of the first Whole Earth Catalog. And the caption was, "We can't put it together, it is together." By the way, they made so much money that at a meeting in San Francisco a couple of years later, they said, "We have a problem." There were about 500 or 600 of us in an auditorium. "We have a problem of success." And a big wad of $100 bills was shown, and it was passed around the auditorium. This is the 60s in San Francisco. "We have a problem. We don't know what to do with excess profits," because the temptation is then to use that as a power tool to build up the identifications that we're trying hard not to be limited by. And the word that came out consistently at the time was ecology. It's not about just an order, it's about an ecology, which is the cycling, the recycling of a mystery with the world that together gives us the real. Thomas Jefferson, in setting up the University of Virginia, had built upon what we have talked about in the first 4 Hermetic America presentations, the foundation field that Benjamin Franklin had set up. That Franklin, working initially out of Boston, then out of Philadelphia, then out of London, back to Philadelphia, then to Paris, then back to Philadelphia. And again, each time he came back to Philadelphia, he deepened and deepened this kind of a spiral. It's an auguring in, but at the same time, it's a spiraling out. And in the Renaissance, it was discovered that there's a natural form for this, that the chambered nautilus, seashell, has a mathematical form that is perfect, that one can understand a graduated expansion in terms of the precision of the rotation. And next week I'll bring in, there are a couple of classic books in the early 20th century done on this. A man named Hambridge did 3 books on this, and they were reprinted by Dover Science Books. What is important is that Franklin, when he first went to Philadelphia, he founded a group called the Junto, which were young men who read together. They bought books together, pooled their money so they could buy more books, and they kept them in this room where they met, and they all read them together, they discussed them together, and it's the beginnings of a shared quality of understanding. And out of this, when he came back to Philadelphia the second time, after being in London for a couple of years to try and learn the printing trade better, he founded several different formats by which people could learn together. The most popular one that was read everywhere was the idea of having an almanac. There were many almanacs, but he called his Poor Richard's Almanac, that interspersed little proverbial bits of wisdom and other indications that were primordially transformable. The earliest 1733 Poor Richard's Almanac had a table of solar time as opposed to calendar time, that they are not the same, they're different. And so the distribution of Poor Richard's Almanac all through the colonies got the common people used to the idea that there are different kinds of time. It isn't just that we have a calendar, it is that the star system has a calendar as well, and we can understand both and modulate both, and there is such a thing as star sidereal time, and getting people used now that there are at least 3 levels of time. There's time on Earth, there's time in the immediate planets and sun and moon, there's time in the heavens, in the stars. And so one gets a trismegistic understanding of the first dimension primordially without being told that you are learning universal secret wisdom. Another is that the Jinto was increased so that now one began to have, for the first time in the world, the first public library in Philadelphia. Not a library held by monks, not a library held by just royals, not a library held by some kind of a group trying to get an edge on everyone, but a public library that anyone could belong to. I still carry proudly in my pocket my little Beverly Hills library card. I have plenty of books, but I love to go down there and just be there. One of our great science fiction writers, Ray Bradbury, said, "I never went to college, but I read in the Los Angeles Library, and that was my university." It is a quality where the public library now is an institution that is almost everywhere. One of the things that Jefferson wanted to set up in 1780, just before he went off to replace Franklin as the minister in France, his proposal was that the colonies be given a kind of a grid where every 5 or 6 square miles there would be a little community local grammar school. And in every maybe 100 square miles, you would have a higher school, and then in a larger geographic grid, you would have a university serving this huge population, and each of these would have libraries within the schools. They would be not only public libraries, but the children would learn to read together, learn to learn together, so that when they became graduated from grammar school, graduated from high school, or graduated from college, they would be able to understand that the public library for the civilization at hand was something to share as adults for the rest of your life. It is this quality of learning that is the quintessential quality of the Hermetic tradition. In the Renaissance, it was rediscovered that this was the missing flint that lit the fire that sparked the torch of freedom. One of the favorite phrases of Jefferson was the freedom of thought. And it was not only a phrase of his, it was a phrase shared among a population of people, very small at the beginning, mostly Franklin and his friends, to which Jefferson was privy. And one of Jefferson's great friendships that came out of this was a friendship with a man named Joseph Priestley. Here's a monograph on Joseph Priestley. He was one of the world's greatest early chemists. He was the discoverer of oxygen. He was also a great doctor. He was a great religious reformer, a great educator. This is Rembrandt Peale's painting of Joseph Priestley. Born in 1733, but in 1791, when the French Revolution broke out, he was criticized immediately by a whole rabid population of people in the city in which he was living, which at that time was Birmingham, England. And he was castigated as stepping on the Bible, stepping on our society, stepping on our civilization. And his house was burnt down. His library was burnt in front of him. His scientific instruments, which were rare in that world, were all shattered. And 3 years later, he received an invitation to move to the United States and be safe here. So in 1794, he came. The last 10 years of his life were spent in Pennsylvania, Northumbria, Pennsylvania. When we come back from the break, I want to give you a few lines from the papers of Thomas Jefferson, a couple of paragraphs from 2 early letters to Joseph Priestley, written early in 1800, when Jefferson was understanding that he had to sacrifice himself yet again. He had to run for president of the United States. And it was in these letters to Joseph Priestley, beginning in January of 1800, that the first seed of the University of Virginia was planted. When Jefferson died in 1826, he died on July 4th, the 50th anniversary to the day of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams, who signed the Declaration of Independence and helped write it, died on the very same day a few hours later. The University of Virginia's rotunda, the last building in his academical village, was finished a couple of months later. And when one takes a look, as we will when we come back, the academical village is a harmonic expansion of Jefferson's own home, Monticello. One of the deep mysteries of Monticello can only be appreciated if one goes above the house into the dome. The inside of the dome is empty. There never was any furniture there. But the dome on the inside is painted sky blue, so that someone could walk around in the dome of where he lives under blue skies. That's living the mystery. That's walking in the presence. It is very hermetic. Let's take a break. Let's come back to our understanding that we are living in a moment by moment, day by day, week by week, year in which the future of the United States is being manifested. One of the qualities that I am able to bring forward has a mystical quality that is associated with the way in which this is occurring. My family moved to the Illinois side of the Wabash River due to a sheepskin land grant given them by Andrew Jackson after the War of 1812, when an ancestor of mine, a ship's surgeon had to swim ashore and was pressed into military service. They couldn't pay him in money, so they gave him a land grant in the territory of Illinois before it was a state. And my family founded West Union, Illinois, about 20 miles from where the Lincoln Log Cabin is, as a national historical site. And so my family grew up in the same little postage stamp area of the United States that Abraham Lincoln did. And I remember at 12, when my father took me around to visit all my relatives in Illinois, whom I had never met. And every little town had a doctor named Weir. And I was told that every Weir had been a doctor since back into Edinburgh, and before that back into the Highlands of Scotland, up around Ben Nevis above Loch Lomond, before our clan was dismembered and banded by the British because we were rebels, revolutionaries. And so Lincoln is a personal family historical figure. I am now the 7th generation. One can understand when my great-great-aunt, Mida, who lived to be 104, reminded my father to take me to Springfield to see the Lincoln House and the State House. And she looked at me through her little octagon glasses and her white curly hair, and she said, "Some of us are still old enough to remember Lincoln personally." And she said, and put a little finger on my cheek, she said, "Remember, we are still Lincoln people." So when Barack Obama announced his candidacy, on the steps of the Lincoln State House in Springfield a year or so ago, I understood very deeply what it means. The quality of the Hermetic tradition is not that it is secret by diagrams, but that it is mysterious by communities of people who transform by learning together. And when they learn together, for 2,500 years, that quality of endeavor has been called love of wisdom, philosophy. And the first people to call themselves lovers of wisdom were the Pythagorean communities. Pythagoras is the first person in the world to use that term of himself. I am a philosopher. This was 500 years before Jesus. Pythagoras was a contemporary of the historical Buddha and a contemporary of Confucius and Lao Tzu in China. So that was a formative period, about 500 BC. And out of that formative period, the entire ancient world changed. It changed its tempo. It became more intensely integral than it had ever been. In addition to Lao Tzu and Confucius, the historical Buddha and Pythagoras, there was a revival of the ancient Zarathustra in the new development of the Achaemenid dynasty in Iran with Cyrus the Great and his successors. Zarathustra lived about 1800 BC, but the revival around 500 BC was the formative one. At that time period, what was emphasized was the way in which learning together had variations all of which could work in a spectrum of possibilities. Now, the Chinese at the time were not known very much to the West. They were known to Central Asia, to the original Zoroastrian civilization, but so much time had gone by that there really was only a sporadic contact. The main focus was from India to the Aegean, from Ethiopia to Armenia. In that big diamond was the great jewel of transform at the time. The most powerful of the transforms was held, positioned as a pivot in Egypt. And the Egyptian tradition, which had received not only the Old Kingdom transforms and the Middle Kingdom transforms, but also the New Kingdom transforms that brought in a deepening of the original Middle Kingdom transforms. The easy rule of thumb is that the hieroglyphs were first written on the insides of pyramids at the end of the Old Kingdom. The pyramid of Wenis, W-E-N-I-S, sometimes spelled and pronounced Unas, U-N-A-S, is the first time that there were hieroglyphics on the inside of the pyramid. The next stage was to put the hieroglyphs on the coffins, so that instead of having just pyramid text, which are the oldest written texts that are recoverable in the world, up until the discovery of some of the early cuneiform writings of the Akkadian civilization that go back equally as ancient. But the pyramid text gave way to the coffin texts, and in the New Kingdom, they gave way to a Book of the Dead. And the Egyptian Book of the Dead is a record on a very large scroll of many chapters that are selected out for various funerary performances. And one of the most profound is the 164th chapter of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which goes back to the original pyramid texts of Thoth. One of the qualities of that is that time has a living form whereby it does not repeat as a circle, but that it transforms its cycle. And the original hieroglyphic for that was the king cobra standing on its powerful tail, so that the body came around and described what, when put horizontally, is the infinity sign, and it is a collection of the king cobras together that are the living time. And I have put them in a rainbow set, courtesy of Paul Murdoch Architects, Design Proficiency, so that you have a rainbow infinity that is in a set of 8. Because the Learning Civilization program that I developed over 40 years is a direct inheritance of all of the Hermetic education sets and cycles and ecologies going back to the origins of civilization. So it is restated for a new time form, for a time form when our kind will inhabit as our home the entire star system. We will be a star wisdom people. Homo sapiens stellaris, star wisdom man. And we will be at home on the interstellar frontier. Now, Pythagoras set up communities that were able to inform the areas in which they were founded, and so they expanded. The ancient Egyptian wisdom that Pythagoras learned for over 20 years in Egypt was that there were sacred sites where the focus was kept. The original focus in ancient Egypt was Abydos in the first and second dynasties. But when the focus moved further, a city to the sun, Heliopolis, was eventually the number one place in Egypt where an educated priesthood for many thousands of years kept an ongoing training so that there would be a lineage of purity. Now, it's very interesting because if one looks at, we have statues and paintings of Egyptian priests from 1400 BC, and they look exactly with the shaved heads and with the woven linen robes. They look like Buddhist monks. You don't find Buddhist monks until one comes in the lifetime of the historical Buddha to about 540 BC. Those monks formed the Sangha, which was a community that learns together. But one of the qualities of the historical Buddha was that before there were monks, before there was a Sangha, his first 5 disciples were businessmen who asked for the gift of teaching before the Buddha knew that he could teach. And the historical Buddha is recorded in the Great Life, the Mahavastu, that he had so disappeared out of the phenomenal world, out of the referential structure of the mind, that he did not know when he was offered food. He records, I had no hands to receive it. I had no mouth to chew it. I had no belly to digest it. How could I receive food? And so he just simply reached out and received it. When they asked the obvious holy person for some guidance in their lives, he wondered how he could speak because he had no tongue, how he could tell them because he had no voice, how he could do anything, and he just began teaching. One of the qualities is that the zero-ness of the mystery is not there phenomenally, it is there before it is a phenomenon. It is a dynamic that occurs in reality, and reality is deeper than existence. Reality includes the articulation that the interspersal of an eternal field among appearances gives it then the opportunity to have a transformational cadence that is able to access openness. That openness is a part of spiritual reality. The access of it is called freedom, freedom of mind. When Jefferson inherited, after several thousands of years, the insight, the vision that they were about to create new conditions for a new kind of mankind, one of the qualities that was not apparent to them, because they were Enlightenment classical Europeans largely, they had not yet deepened, as we will see, that Hermetic America in the next generation swiftly deepened. There is a vast difference. Though there's quality all the time, there's a vast difference between Thomas Jefferson and someone like Henry David Thoreau. the quality that is there is a quality where this couple of letters from the collected works of Thomas Jefferson to Joseph Priestley gives us an idea of the seed. He writes to him in January 18th, 1800, saying, "I've bought several sets of your works and pamphlets. Eventually, Joseph Priestley's collected works will be 26 volumes. I'm fortunate enough to have a set of those. His works, this is a translation of his History of Electricity into French, originally 1767. This is 1771, and already 3 thick volumes dominated by Benjamin Franklin. It is Benjamin Franklin who comes exactly 2,000 years after Alexander the Great. He is an aeonic figure to Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great is exactly 2,000 years after Sargon of Akkad, the North Semitic King of Kings, the first King of Kings, the first to have an international civilization that spread from Cyprus to the Indus in India, from Egypt down into Nubia, all the way up into northern Anatolia near Mount Ararat and the Black Sea. That was 2400 BC. So from Sargon of Akkad to Alexander the Great to Benjamin Franklin is a 4,000-year double aeon period. What happens is that particular historical cycle is the churning of the ground. But it is the planting of the seeds. It is the tending of the crops. It is the harvesting of that crop that takes about 300 years. And so there is another aeonic period that follows as the harvest. Jesus comes about 300 years after Alexander the Great. We come about 300 years after Benjamin Franklin. And about 300 years after Sargon of Akkad is Abraham, the first patriarch in the Jewish tradition. So that there are overlapping huge time forms, each having their own cycles. But in those cycles, the most powerful, integral, is the last 500-year period of an aeon. So from 500 BC to Jesus is a compression pressure that turns the carbon of the ink into the diamond of the spiritual person. The Renaissance began the seed of a recovering of Hermetic wisdom. And in our time, we're turning that into a community of stellar jewel people. And this education, the learning civilization, is the educational vehicle to offer itself to accomplish that. This series on Hermetic America is tracing the last 300 years to see how it was that 500 years ago in Florence, Italy, the founding of the Florentine Academy by Cosimo de' Medici with Marsilio Ficino as the head led 200 years later to the development of Benjamin Franklin's work largely in Philadelphia. So that my original prequel to Hermetic America, written by 1983, researched for about 3 years, the Huntington major libraries in the Los Angeles area, Hermetic Roots of America, Ficino's Renaissance to Franklin's Republic, from Ptolemy Philadelphus to Philadelphia, PA. It is this quality of having researched meticulously how we went from the Renaissance to the United States, in that 200-year period, by tracing exactly how the different, not individuals, but the prismatic spiritual persons who then gave out a spectrum of possibilities, the selection of them was as much of an art as the ability to create one's own vision. The key to this is the ancient Hermetic understanding that the process field of consciousness is remembering. But because it is able to exchange its quality with the structure that in the symbolic order of the mind is the most powerful, which is the imagination. The imagination does a do-si-do with remembering, and remembering now in the mind joins the imagination and becomes the memory. And the imagination from the symbolic order flows creatively in the field of vision with remembering and becomes creative imagining. When you have creative imagining and remembering, you have a fertile field now out of which arts can come. And those arts are not just of painting, they're not just of sculpting, but those arts are classically, in a Pythagorean way, presented as domains of muses. And there was a set of 9 muses. And those 9 muses are the feminine wisdom of the spirit, who gift the access to the field of freedom of consciousness so that men may not only learn, but they may learn together with the fertile creative imagining and remembering that the feminine brings into play. This quality has a very marked harmonic. The 9 muses are held as a set, not as some kind of just order, but as a set by a 10th. And that 10th is the mythological figure of Apollo, who becomes now the god who mythologically enables art to occur, but also enables medicine to occur, and also enables prophecy to occur. The prophetic dimension of Apollo was the oracle at Delphi. Part of the order of Apollo, the art of holding a number of kingdoms together, a number of city-states together, is the common treasury of Apollo on the little island of Delos in the Aegean. So that there is an art to government, which has an Apollonian guarantee that the resonances will be a harmonic. And when they are harmonic, they are now able to be used as a scale, as a spectrum. Maybe the best English term for this is the scientific term for it, as a scalar. Now one can measure in a scalar, and a scalar is able to transform itself so that it not only measures existential things and symbolic orders in their integral thusness, but is also able to measure ratios that are ratios of the real and not just simply ratios of identity. So that now one has a very interesting emergence that music dealing with harmonics and architecture dealing with harmonics are all about the scalar of proportional ratios of the real. When Jefferson went to set up his academical village, there is definitely an Apollonian order. There are 10 buildings, 5 on the west side, 5 on the east side, with a central rotunda at the head of it. The central rotunda is the common home of the community, and each of the 10 pavilions were originally professorships. The professor lived in that pavilion. Another professor lived in another pavilion. On the west side, facing west, they were the odd-numbered ones. On the east side, facing east, the Atlantic, the past, were the even-numbered ones. In behind these 10 pavilions, each to hold a professor, in between were houses for students, little areas where they could live, and in common on top of them was a walkway, and that walkway on both sides was like 2 linking corridors where the students could walk in the open air of nature under their skies. And underneath those 2 walkways were covered corridors with receding frames into the distance where they could walk sheltered together to get into their classes in the various pavilions. And next week when I bring some illustrations of this, you'll be able to see a little clearer. The first time in history that one finds a corridor through frames of reference going back into the distance. The first time that happens in history is 3200 BC in the Boyne Valley of Ireland. A domed Paleolithic transformed structure called Newgrange. And Newgrange was specifically made so that that corridor, only one time out of one day, out of a year, would be illuminated all the way through the corridor. The sun's rays would penetrate through the entire corridor and illuminate a sun symbol at the very far back, which was the center of the dome structure. It was a way of understanding we know how to build architecturally in terms of the actual motion of the sun and the moon and the planets and the stars. Our stones and our stars are aligned in such a way that we have scaled ourselves to do this. And so our calendar follows, not slavishly just that particular tone, but that we have another cycle of ceremonies in our calendar that prepare us for that and that follow up the ceremony with an appreciation of that. And so there is a parenthesis of preparation and appreciation that cup like Apollo, the actual set of the ceremony. The Blackfoot Indian major ceremony in the middle of this continent in Algonquin, it's Okan. The Okan was an 8-day ceremony at the summer solstice, split right so that the summer solstice came at the middle of the 8 days. But the beginning of the preparation for that was done in February, when it's brutal cold. And a holy woman began it by making a prayer that she would sponsor the sun dance. She would guarantee the tribe and all visiting guests that this would be a holy occasion. And her prayer was to remain pristinely holy from February right down to the summer solstice. And she was camped out in her own hut. And she was tended to by many of the young women, unmarried, because they were keeping their purity together. And one of the qualities of the holy woman is that she alone could take the dried buffalo tongues and cut them into morsels of communion food, given only if the men were able to display that they had the spiritual courage to endure beyond the limits of physicality, beyond the projections of mentality, and to inhabit the transcendental freedom of the Spirit. And that young man chosen would have to skewer himself with buffalo bone hooks and thong hide ropes going to the top of the Sundance pole, which was the center of that hut. The center of that hut was a tree that had a big fork in it, and that tree had to be freshly cut at every year that a Sundance and Okan was offered. And only warriors who had fought in war were able to go out and find that tree and sit around that tree and sing to that tree, because it was the enemy, holy enemy, because it is the holy willingness to enter into conflict and come out not as a victor, but as someone who is prepared to now offer one's courage to the community. As the women offer their purity to the community, the men offer their courage to the community. And this way, life gains its articulation of mystery and of further transformed possibilities. Without it, it cannot go on. Here's an excerpt from Jefferson to Joseph Priestley. 1800 is often called the real American Revolution, the Revolution of 1800. Up until then, the dominant power structure in the new United States was monarchist federalist. Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, even George Washington, to keep control and to have a further solidifying. Jefferson called them monarchists, secret monarchists. They controlled the money. They controlled the power. What we want to do is liberate the power to share the money so that further possibilities of exploration can open up. You recognize some of the issues today. He says to Priestley, I hope that you are able to talk to an envoy from me. His name is Monsieur Dupont, and he is a very trustworthy man like you, originally from France, now an American, because I have an idea for a new kind of a school, an American university. We wish to establish in the upper and healthier country, not the coast of Virginia, but the uplands of Virginia, where he lived, Charlotte, and more centrally for the state, a university on a plan so broad and liberal and so modern as to be worth patronizing with the public support, and be a temptation to the youth of other states to come and drink the cup of knowledge and fraternize with us. The first step is to obtain a good plan. That is a judicious selection of the sciences and practicable grouping of some of them together and ramifying of others so as to adapt the professorships to our uses and our means. In an institution meant chiefly for use, some branches of science, formerly esteemed, may now be omitted, so may others now valued in Europe, but useless to us for ages to come. Take as an example of the former, the Oriental learning, and of the latter, almost the whole of the institution proposed to Congress by the Secretary of War's report of the 5th. The Secretary of War was James McHenry, and this was the seed out of which Jefferson later founded West Point. That war should not be a savage prerogative for most men under a privileged leadership of nobles, but that the military should be trained together so that the fighting force is more like a tool to be used than a normal recourse for simply expanding or protecting. He says, now there is no one to whom this subject is so familiar as yourself, as there is no one in the world who equally with you unites the full possession of the subject with such a knowledge of the state of our existence as enables you to fit the garment to him who is to pay for it and wear it. A university for the people to learn together. The subjects that he wrote off his cuff: botany, chemistry, zoology, anatomy, surgery, medicine, geography, politics, commerce, history, ethics, law, arts, fine arts. And this list is imperfect because I make it hastily. A couple of weeks later, he sent another letter saying, and I forgot to emphasize languages. That this was to be a new kind of a gathering place. An exemplar by which people could come and visit and begin to understand that there are now new possibilities. I remember after the first successes of my program designing in Calgary, Alberta, in the third year that I was there in 1973, we began to have international visitors all the time because it was a building of 15 acres without walls. It was truly a university without walls. And the courses were in an ecology of being able to be repositioned in many different places. Sometimes when the weather permitted, I would take the courses off campus, outside. Many times to downtown Calgary, to the Indian Friendship Center. Many times out to the reservation at Gleason, to acquaint everyone with the fact that though a small part of the population, the original human beings who lived in that part of North America were the Indians, and that they had to be included in any scalar that was going to be real. Next week, we will take a look at the way in which the Hermetic America tradition of education took its fount from the University of Virginia, from the University of Pennsylvania, and initiated the last 200 years of genius in learning. And some of the greatest of the Hermetic Americans are those who devoted their lives and their skills and their talents to helping us see we are not beasts in a free-for-all to pull out as much of the meat as we can, as fast as we can. Damn the others. But it's what the Italians call the paisano style. We cook together, and we put a common bowl in the center of the table. And in the conviviality of being together and talking together, we all get filled. And we all are able to have that happy evening where we are safe because we are safe together. More next week.